So what does a librarian do? When we ask that question, we get some interesting responses.
Read books all day, answer questions, shush people.
Right, but typically, no one gives the answer that describes what we do.
So as librarians, we have a unique set of skills that help us to conduct research. We love to use those skills to uncover what we call hidden histories. In a sense, we're like detectives that travel to different archives and museums to collect facts. And we put those together to tell a story that has been left out of the dominant historical narrative. Librarians are pretty curious by nature, so when Hayley and I came across some news articles about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, we began research into that topic, but here in Louisiana. So, a Google search here, a few articles there, and when we didn't find anything, we began to reach out to people at different libraries and museums across the state.
So today, we are taking you on a journey of discovery into an internment camp in Louisiana. We will share the story of a man who was a community builder and leader. This man was unfairly targeted due to his country of origin and religion, and because of those factors, was forced to undergo a traumatic 4-year journey through internment.
We were surprised to find that no one in the state knew about this. Eventually, we were given a name and place: Kohara family, Alexandria, Louisiana. The Koharas were the only Japanese family living in Alexandria during World War II, so we figured if anyone would know about this, maybe they would. Miss Marion Kohara was a teenager during World War II, and she recounted to us her family connection to Camp Livingston, on an Army base here in Louisiana. She had a relative that lived in Hawaii who was actually interned at Camp Livingston. So with just a name, Buntetsu Miyamoto, we began research to try to uncover anything we could about this and his experience during World War II.
What we are sharing with you is the story of one man, but his story is also the story of thousands of Japanese men just like him during wartime in the United States. Buntetsu Miyamoto came to Hawaii from Japan in 1928, and he built a life on the island of Oahu. He was a family man, principal of a Japanese language school, and Buddhist priest. Even though his children were American citizens and he had no plans to ever return to Japan, he was unable to become a naturalized citizen. This was because of anti-Asian immigration laws that would remain in effect until 1952.
So in the 1920s, the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence began a top-secret surveillance program in response to rising nationalism in Japan. This surveillance targeted members of the Japanese community who were living peacefully in Hawaii and on the West Coast. On December 7th, 1941, Buntetsu was returning home from his daily morning swim, and he looked up and he watched as a group of planes flew overhead. What he did not know, and what he could not know, was that these were the Japanese fighter planes on their way to bomb Pearl Harbor. By that evening, Buntetsu would be arrested by 2 FBI agents and a local policeman. He would be incarcerated and then interned for the next 4 years.
After his arrest, Buntetsu was shuffled around the United States to various Army camps before coming to Camp Livingston, where he would spend almost 1 year imprisoned. The type of internment that we are talking about here is different than what we know from history books and photographs.
Yeah, so you might be familiar with the types of camps created with Executive Order 9066. These camps were located on the West Coast and held Japanese Americans. Of the 120,000 interned in these camps, 2/3 were US citizens. These West Coast camps held families and are considered incarceration camps.
So what Buntetsu experienced was internment, or the legally permissible detention of enemy aliens during times of war. When Japan attacked the United States, Buntetsu's status changed overnight, from resident alien to enemy alien. The internment camps that we are focused on, like Camp Livingston, were run by the Army or Justice Department and held only men.
Camp Livingston was built in 1940 in central Louisiana. It was the site of the famous Louisiana maneuvers, a 400,000-man army training exercise that actually helped to create our modern fighting forces. The darker history that Camp Livingston held includes the internment camp located within its 18,000 acres. Buntetsu would spend 10 months here, interned with over 1,000 other men of Japanese ancestry. And while we have no record of how he spent his time in camp, we do, however, have records from some of the other men who were interned with Buntetsu.
And we found these records through exhaustive research, calling people, scouring the internet, and visiting archives from Washington, D.C. to California. And through this, we were able to find letters, journals, and photographs of other men who were also held at Camp Livingston.
All of these pieces of information can be compiled together to help form a picture of life inside camp that wouldn't otherwise exist. When someone is incarcerated, apart from their family for years, the physical, emotional, and psychological toll taken on that individual can be life-altering. It can drive men to lose their hope and even their sanity.
Many examples of the strain of internment exist. One documented example occurred at an internment camp in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Oshima, a man who was interned there, was a shopkeeper with 11 children. Oshima was overcome with concern for his large family, his business contracts, and the threat of being deported back to Japan. The strain of separation and worry over all of his obligations overwhelmed him, and he tried to climb the internment camp fence. The other internees, however, recognized that Oshima was just out of his mind with worry, and they pleaded with the guards to not shoot him. But because of heightened tensions, their pleas were ignored, and Oshima's life ended tragically at the hands of the guards.
From their angst and isolation, one coping mechanism utilized by the Japanese men in these camps emerged: the practice of gaman, or enduring the unbearable. This practice has been documented across numerous camps during this time, and at Camp Livingston, we found one example. The men created art, calligraphy panels, wooden carvings, polished stone, flower arrangements, all held in a type of museum that the men had created themselves to display their own art.
It's important to note, though, that the men were not the only ones that suffered. From the moment that Buntetsu was arrested, his family also began to suffer. His family was unable to make ends meet, and most of their community was afraid to help because of possible repercussions by the US government. So, Buntetsu's wife, Fumi, decided to enter a special family internment camp located in Crystal City, Texas. The decision to leave their home, their friends, and their community was made in the hope of being reunited with Buntetsu at some point, which was a possibility, but not a guarantee. Fumi was 41, Carol was 16, Clifford was 13, and Doris was 6.
After having his name cleared, Buntetsu would eventually be allowed to reunite with his family in Crystal City, Texas in 1943. The family wouldn't be allowed to return home, however, until after the conclusion of the war. Back in Hawaii, they had to rebuild their lives from scratch. They had to restore the temple that had been occupied by the army during the war. They had to resettle back into their community and reestablish their lives. Buntetsu resumed his role as a Buddhist priest, and his children would grow up not knowing the full story of what had happened to him during his internment. It was something no one wanted to talk about.
When we move beyond statistics and faded names found on paper in archives, we can begin to uncover the lives of these men and place humanity back into their stories. That is what we did with Buntetsu. We went from a name on paper in an archive to the human and very real story of an immigrant's experience in the United States. Buntetsu followed all the rules, and he understood the importance of embracing the country where he chose to live and where his children were citizens. And even after surviving that traumatic and unfair internment, Buntetsu chose to live the rest of his life in the United States.
In archives, these forgotten and marginalized histories are still waiting to be uncovered. The events put before you today, the history put before you today, buried in archives, scattered across the country, effectively silencing the voices of those men and their families. These events happened only 77 years ago. And we need to ask ourselves if we want to repeat this history. Today, our government is making similar policies and decisions that affect people based on race, religion, immigration status, and a host of other factors. We can use these hidden histories as a vital tool to help society consider how both our actions and inactions today create the archives that will be uncovered in another 77 years.
What should that archive look like?
And what will that archive look like? Thank you.
Thank you.